Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I want to do today is just talk a bit about what we know about payment systems and their uses, some of the issues that arise if you use them. Because one of the ways that many publishers have been approaching the issues of payment is, do we charge or do we not charge? And that's really not the right questions, because the questions ultimately get into how do you charge, what do you charge for, when do you start charging, all of these kind of deeper issues. We are moving to a point where being free and providing free content is not going to be the default as it is now. Already in North America, about half of all publishers are now requiring payments for some services, and we're moving that way in Europe as well. But there's some things that one has to think about in deciding when one is going to charge and what's going to make it work for you along the way. It is becoming a very viable kind of operation to go ahead and to charge. And essentially, we've been doing a number of studies around the world in this regard. And our digital news report that we've just completed for this second year here now basically shows that consumers are really becoming used to the idea that they have to pay for news. And we've already got 10% of all digital users in the market surveyed showing that they have already paid somebody for some digital news. This is an important milestone, because when you really think about paying for news, in most countries, only between about 25 and 40% of households actually pay for news in print. So we're moving very clearly toward an era where it's being accepted in some form or another that it's going to have to be there. When we do willingness to pay studies, and looking, we basically find that there's about 14% willingness to pay among the general population of digital users. But among those people that identify themselves as heavy users of news, it's almost up to 20%. So we start saying, if we can start to actually move into having them pay, we start to build a reasonable revenue stream on which to fund journalistic activities or other kinds of content activities that might come into play. The really interesting thing was when we asked people, do you expect to pay? And almost a quarter of the public expect they're going to have to pay in the near future to get good news. There'll always be that flow of events news, the kind of breaking news kind of things that come that they'll be able to get from online news services that are paid for by aggregators, for instance, and from other sources, but they're expecting that they're going to have to pay. Now, this is a dramatic sea shift in the way that we have approached payment and thought about payment and what it was going to do in the digital environment. Because 2 years ago, nobody believed you could get anybody willing to pay and thinking that they were going to pay for news. But that's becoming clear, because it's not just that they're going to have to pay for news. They are now paying for a range of other kinds of content and becoming used to doing so in doing that. Now, one of the interesting things that happens when we look at these is the fact that when they are paying now, they're more likely to pay with tablets and with smartphone apps than for simple computer-accessed information. And the reason is not that necessarily the news is different in those, but the fact that in those systems, there are better infrastructures for easier payment and for easier transactions taking place. And because many news organizations are presenting news in different ways on those platforms than they have traditionally done on the web-based platform. And as a result of that, people feel they're getting more and are willing to do something along the way. So the fact that that platform there is important. There is another factor, though, and that is the presence of free competitors. And if you have very good free competitors providing fairly high-quality news, the willingness to pay goes down. So there's a great problem in the United Kingdom right now because there are two high-quality free providers available, and that is The Guardian and the BBC Online, both of which provide very, very good news services. Now, you saw in Germany, for instance, a great reaction against public service broadcasters, and in fact, the publishers actually got the public broadcasters limited in what they can do in terms of news online. The interesting thing is the publishers have not moved into news online now that they've got the protection against the others, which is kind of an interesting kind of problem that they're going to have to work through. And in fact, digital news use in Germany is among the lowest in all of Europe, which is quite an interesting kind of problem. When you make choices to go to pay, however, you have to expect effects. And they're real effects. If you go to a hard wall, that is, you don't allow people in at all, and you don't allow information to reach them without going through the wall, you're going to lose about 90% of your audience. Okay? Now, that's painful along the way. The end question is, are you actually getting more money in the other end of things? And we'll talk about that in a minute. If you go to freemium models or metered models of various kinds, you lose far less of your traffic coming through. And so what this does is give you an ability to engineer what you want to do with your audience, because you're going to make trade-offs in this kind of setting along the way. Obviously, we have, because we're two-sided platforms generally here, if you have a free site available, you're going to drive a lot of traffic. You drive traffic, you can increase your ad revenue. And that's a very useful thing to do, of course. If you do a paid site and have a hard wall, then you're going to drive consumer revenue on the wall. And our emphasis and what we're trying to achieve in this situation is the best revenue we can get. And for some people, having a hard wall, where you get just consumer payments, will get the highest amount of revenue. For other kinds of publishers, having a mix of them that takes from both having a metered system or something of that sort gives you perhaps a better choice by having some traffic income coming in as well. But the choice to live on traffic alone really can only be done probably by 2 to 3 publishers in a country, and they have to be large publishers that generate a lot of traffic, or that kind of thing doesn't work. But each publisher is ultimately going to have to find the path that works for them. Now, the questions that we have as we look, I mean, we talk about these various models, and the freemium model is often talked about as along the way, which is essentially a classic upselling technique, which basically says we give you something free, and then for more, you have to pay for it. All right, that's a very, very classic kind of system. But if you use that system, you have to start making choices that you never had to make before. You have to decide what articles are going to be free and what are going to be paid. What sections are going to be free and what sections are going to be paid. What writers are going to be free and what writers are going to be paid. Because those are all part of this mix of making that choice along the way. And then you have to start making choices is, how long is something behind the paywall? Is it behind the paywall for 6 hours, for 12 hours, for a day, forever? Very, very interesting questions you have to ask. Similarly, you've got to decide how long does stuff stay outside the paywall. Because one of the things that we've noticed for the last 15 years is that people are willing to pay for archives, more willing to pay for archives than for news. So at some point, you're going to want to move what is available outside inside. And in a freemium model, what publishers using this have now found is that it works very well to have maybe a headline and a paragraph or so of the story, but you have to come behind the wall to read the rest. So you're still driving traffic, but you're actually pushing people and using it primarily as a marketing activity to move people to the paid activity as well. So the freemium model works quite quite well in that regard. Now, you hear the talk of the metered model. The metered model is, in fact, a freemium model. Okay? It's just an offshoot of it. It was first started by the Financial Times back in about 2007, I think it was. And basically, under a metered model, you get a few articles up front that you're able to use and read for free. So you're getting lots of traffic come in. But once you hit that limit, then you have to leave. Now, this has worked very well for very, very large publishers. So when the New York Times can do this, New York Times started having 20 articles a month you could use without pay. They've now moved that down to 10. But the idea was to keep that traffic, because the New York Times had about 1.9 million visitors coming in, and they wanted to generate the ad revenue off of that traffic. And they could still do that with a metered model, but couldn't do that very well if they went to a full hard wall, as the Times of London did, for instance. So we see a number of publishers doing this. The average is between about 10 to 15 articles. And interestingly, a number of the larger ones are now moving it down to the 5 to 10 range. But it provides some interesting operations for you and some interesting options to make that kind of thing work. And those are working. And so we're seeing different ways to approach these along the way. The newest thing that's happening, which is happening in the US, and we don't know yet how well this is working, is that newspapers that previously had free sites are now setting up separate sites that are paid. So in this case, the Boston Globe, which had boston.com as its free site, has now set up a completely paid site, which is Boston Globe down here. And it is being done in this regard simply to say that there is something better out there and more valuable than the free site. And so they're still generating traffic on one, but then having paid on the other. And the argument is that there are a lot of branding benefits for doing this. There are a lot of marketing benefits for doing this. The San Francisco Chronicle has just done this. They have San Francisco Gate, which is their free site. But on their Chronicle site, you pay a $12 a month fee for that, and you get access across platforms with that. Plus, you get the Sunday physical edition with it as well. And of course, the Sunday edition in America Papers is important because of a lot of inserts and advertising and such things. So it actually builds up that site as well. So we're seeing a lot of experimentation being done by separating previously free sites, because it is believed that it's harder to take a free site and make it paid than to just start up a new paid site along the way. Now, there are a lot of issues that come in here, and I'll talk for about another 10, 15 minutes, and then I think it's better for us just to have a conversation about what you're thinking about and what's worrying along the way. But a lot of companies now are using subscription systems to try to as they move to pay systems. And you get a lot of questions here. And the question is do you raise the price? Is the price higher for digital, lower, or the same for the print edition? All three categories are being used by different publishers. Some argue that, in fact, in a digital world, we're giving you much more background material, access to original data, reports, and other such things that you don't have, therefore it's worth more. Others argue, well, it's cheaper for us to deliver, therefore we should take the costs, some of the cost savings, and give it to the readers. The choice of doing so, there's no evidence today of which this is the best way. I'm a fan that if you're going to go to pay, you might as well really go to pay, and why would you give them a break from the other kinds of forms? The big question is, what do subscribers get that they don't get offline? And one of the reasons you want to ask this question is because over a period of time, you want to start converting your print readers to being offline readers. Because over a period of 10 years or so, you may in fact have to get to a point where you make decisions about whether you maintain the other product along the way as well. Very clearly, most of the market research of people considering paying for news shows an expectation that there will be something else there, that there are advantages to being in the digital world, and people are expecting that when they go to the digital news products, that many of those advantages will be present. And so we have to start asking questions about what are we going to give them there, and not just thinking we're going to transfer our existing product to these other platforms and make it work. The other question is how do you take money? If you have to take the money online, it is very expensive in many ways, simply because of the payment costs for banks and others to process. Some are starting to use prepaid systems and others to deal with this to try to reduce some of the costs. But we come into some really good questions of which way do you accept payment? Is it all in a digital form or offline? And those are issues you're going to have to wrestle with, because there are a lot of transaction costs that come in with subscription payment. There's a lot of transaction costs because of the intermediaries that have to be involved there along the way. This is particularly bad for smaller publishers, because the cost efficiency problems exist for smaller publishers, where if you have a larger subscription base or a larger circulation base of people that are coming to your site, the cost per unit goes down along the way. So you really have to think about those costs and what additional auditing costs are going to be there, and accounting costs that come from these. The issues of actually trading and conveying funds. And there are about 4 or 5 different ways you can do this. One is taking credit cards, one is taking cash, one's using various general money accounts and other such things, but they all have cost systems that are there. Now, a lot of smaller publishers are starting to go into cooperative payment systems. And these cooperative payment systems are designed to get over the cost problem of operating the system of your own. And what you're seeing, and two of the largest ones now are Press Plus and Piano, which is operating heavily in Europe at the moment, which basically bring you an entire system of payment system in. You integrate it into your sites or into your other digital products. And a subscription is paid that will allow the subscriber access to your site. But not only access to your site, access to others who are part of that system. So you'll go through your site, read your paper, and maybe go read other papers as well, and can do that along the way. And normally you get a division there of money there that's about what you get elsewhere, a 30% service fee for the system and the processing along the way. And then the bulk of the money going to the publisher, but also a part of it going to other publishers where secondary use might be made. But you actually come through your own site when you deal that. There are emerging in a number of fields in media today, a number of cooperative arrangements that are occurring. Next issue is a particularly interesting cooperative that's been put together by a number of the largest magazine publishing companies. And it essentially, you buy a subscription, and from it you can get to 100 consumer magazines for any of them you want, as much as you want along the way. And what these publishers are doing is trying to break the stranglehold and the 30% fee that is required by a lot of these commercial providers, because they believe they can operate the system much more efficiently and thus keep much more of the money in the companies as well. So we're seeing a lot of cooperation start to work in these, and it's particularly important for when you're dealing with titles that have, we've been getting more and more specialized titles, they get smaller and smaller in revenue. So anytime you have relatively small circulations, this becomes cooperation becomes a great advantage for doing these kind of things. Now, when you look at payment, we often think of the subscription as the payment, but there are actually a lot of different kinds of payments being taken now on pay systems for news and other media content. A single article can be had, you can have a subscription, you have different ways that these can be done. If you have single articles or day passes along the way, or weekly access even, you're really into the area of micropayments. And because you're changing very little amount of money, it's changing hands when you're doing that. The problem with micropayments, of course, is that the costs of the transaction, of moving the money, can actually exceed sometimes what is received. And that becomes hugely problematic if you're doing it. It also creates some other interesting problems. When you start selling articles as individual articles, you have to now start asking some questions about pricing those articles, because some articles and some content is more valuable than other content. So do you price everything the same price, or do you have differential prices? Or do you have an algorithm built in that the more an article is accessed, the price goes up? You can do different kinds of ways of dealing with this, and so you have to really start thinking through what your payment system is going to do and how it's going to work. But essentially, the problem is if you set prices on your own ahead of time, that means you're having to decide ahead of time that this article is more valuable than that article. And that becomes a real problem unless you just go to flat rate pricing, which is what a lot of companies have done just because it's easier. But in fact, when you have high demand articles, particularly if you've got exclusive articles or articles that are having great impact, you might as well charge a premium price for it. And once you've built an electronic system to take care of this, that can be accommodated, and you have choices that you can make there along the way. And those are things you want to be thinking about as you move this way. Now, one of the interesting things that's happening, and we see in a number of places as we do our studies, is that there's a real split in payment models that is occurring. And in countries, many countries like a subscription model and are using that model, but a number of other countries, you're seeing the single copy or the micro-purchase kind or the single article kind of purchase or a one-day purchase occurring. And so subscriptions very, very high in the Germanic nations, if you will, the US, Japan, and we're seeing in Southern Europe and Latin countries as a whole a more move toward the micro-purchase kind of approach for doing this kind of thing. We think there's a reason for it, and we think it has to do with the way they buy the print editions. That in places where you're used to buying subscriptions to print, they seem to be happy buying subscriptions on the digital pay systems. In places where single copy sales primarily dominate, they seem to like buying in smaller batches online as well as offline. That's a very interesting kind of change because it's not what many people thought about and thought would happen, but it's something, therefore, that you have to think about what are the patterns in your country because it will affect the demand for the kind of things that you offer along the way there. Now, we're getting a number of born players that were digital natives to begin with that are actually starting to make this work and make it work quite well. Mediapart now, after a period of about 5 years, is now making money. It's making a return about 12% last year, which is not a bad return online. Why is it successful? Well, it's not successful in making money because it has a pay system. It is successful in making money simply because it does something that most other newspapers in France did not do. And that is, it has done a lot of investigative journalism. It has done a lot of journalism that's very hard on governments, that's very hard on government policies, things that, in fact, many of the other newspapers in France have been reticent to do. In its short period of time, it's toppled ministers in both the Sarkozy and the Hollande government. And so it's providing something in a very different way than the traditional players have provided. And so coming in new, it's able to do this and make that kind of thing work. And that is an important part. Another great success story in this regard was Breaking Views, which has been operating now for 5 years. It was just recently bought by the Reuters company. And it is also making a profit. It's making a profit over financial and news analysis and commentary. So there are ways for digital natives to do this as well, but you usually see that they try to do something very different than traditional media have done, or in order to find a place along the way. Size doesn't matter in terms of pay systems and such things. And in fact, we have very small publishers that are doing quite well. The Chinook Observer is one in Washington State in the United States. It has 5,000 print circulation. It prices its online service just slightly lower than the print edition along the way. But it gives a way for even them to start doing it at a small way. But you have to use off-the-shelf kind of technologies. You have to have very simple kind of digital kinds of activities if you're going to do that, because you will never have huge numbers of consumers that are going to pay large amounts to take care of you in that way. So it is very clear that we are moving toward payment. The momentum is gathering there. Very few companies are now debating when they're going to, whether they're going to start paying at some point, but how they're going to make the transitions, what they're going to charge for, how they're going to build systems in different ways. There's lots of interesting experiments going on, and it is important to do experiments and pay in different ways with different groups of consumers as you build your choices. And to understand which is going to do well. There's some places actually that are offering ad-free news. People are more willing to pay for ad-free news, which is very interesting. In other places, people want the news, and I suppose it depends a bit on the publication and the relationship. But one always has the ability in a digital world to just take out the ads that you're putting in the other, and not have them there if that is a model that works well in your market. I'm going to stop there because I think it's more important for each of you to be asking about what you see is happening and what you're worried about in doing this, because I think that'll be more effective for all of us in terms of talking about what's happening with pay systems and what the options there are. So thank you. So I think is there a microphone going around, or if not, we can, if you've got a big voice, that's fine too. So, now I can't believe everybody sitting here has no questions. So, you got to stop being Norwegian and start being people trying to learn again.
Okay, well, I'm not Norwegian, so I'll try to be as Norwegian as I can. You didn't talk at all, actually, about membership models.
Yep.
Is that a viable model, or is anybody doing it? I know the Times of London's trying it.
Yep.
What's your experience there?
Membership models have been used primarily by not-for-profit media, and some of that is working. You're seeing some places that are getting a few thousand members now, and so it is a model that can work. It's not a model that most commercial publishers are comfortable with, but some non-commercial publishers can find that it could be useful. So it can work, but in most cases, you're only getting members, 2,000 to 3,000 members along the way. But for a small 2 or 3 person operation, that can be enough to sustain you, depending on the price of your so. We're watching those very carefully, quite frankly. One of the biggest problems right now with most member models and with most not-for-profit models is they're all now at about 2 to 3 years in, and this is a critical stage for all startups. And we'll be able to see whether they'll be able to survive. A lot of them we've had about 90% of most startups have stopped in online digital news. Which is quite normal. I mean, people say, "Oh, that's terrible." You know, that's normal in any business to have that kind of thing happen. The digital media are the 4th most frequent business to close as a startup. So it's very, very hard to make them work. But that's normally because most of them are starting from scratch. They don't have a brand. They don't have marketing. Very often they don't have business expertise. They don't have a real feel for their market, and that becomes an issue. So.
You were talking about micropayments.
Yes.
Do you see one service becoming more ubiquitous than others? I mean, PayPal or credit cards or Bitcoins or something sort of moving in?
Well, there are a number of them that are being used, and a number of companies that are starting to move into them because they see the necessity for doing so. The important thing about micropayments is it works better if you have a prepaid account and you're coming out of the account, because there's only one actual payment transaction of money. And that's where the costs occur most, is processing. Even a debit card processing is, in most places, so 30 cents or something of that sort. So you've got to get that down. So if you have a system where you deposit money into something like a PayPal or a system, then it's just coming right off the top, and therefore it's coming out of the account, which is really cheap, rather than coming out of a bank account, which is very expensive. So are there going to be dominant players? On a global scale, probably, but they don't necessarily have to be at a national level, because other national systems could be set up to do that. And so in a country like Norway, all publishers, publishers, for instance, whether they be in newspapers and magazines, could come together and create the underlying system. And one of the problems that has occurred over the last 20 years with much digital media developments have been publishers allowed outside firms to do the service for them, because that's traditionally what they had done with other kinds of goods and services. The problem is that in the digital systems today, that's where the money is. It's more there than in what you're transacting. And so you really need to control that infrastructure as a publisher. Either you're big enough to do it on your own, or you do it cooperatively with others. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's very inspiring to hear about these papers that are actually making it and making money. But what's your thoughts on the fact that we are, how many are we? 5 million people in this country. And for example, if you take the freemium model, it's very hard to get enough users to even get more than just a handful of people entering your website more than 10 times a week. So it's quite hard for us to use the New York Times model, for instance. Yep. So what's your solution to this when when you're such a small country as Norway?
Well, I mean, that's essentially a fundamental economic problem with these. Scale matters for certain kinds of operations. And the New York Times can do things because it is a global brand that people come to them from all over the world to read. But that doesn't mean that one can't build up over time competencies and improve one's digital products that maybe in 5 or 10 years might be where it'll be the number one producer. So one has to think that process through. There is a tipping point at some point. I mean, we're at a situation now where in most countries the revenues, at least in the West, the revenues for print are declining, and some places rather quickly. And the digital revenues are rising, but rising at a slower pace. And so there are people that say, oh, the newspapers are going to be dead tomorrow or next year or whatever. And it's not. We're talking years before we reach that point. But even what you need to do is get people used to the digital, get used to the fact that digital media are not free, and build into those systems so that when the tipping point comes, that the question remains, do we keep in print or do we not? You have a choice to make there, and you've got it in place to make it work. Because there's a big learning curve that everybody's going through in terms of how do you make the digital platforms work. And the biggest questions, and Mario was talking about this earlier, is the issue of you cannot tell a story in the same way on most of these digital platforms as you did in print and expect it to be as attractive to people. We're having to look of new ways of doing it. We have to have new layouts, new designs, new ways that people interact with that's a big learning curve for all publishers to get there. So we need to start, and then we need to move on. But when you're dealing with a very small population, that's when you have to cooperate, even with your competitors, to make the systems work, to make them cost efficient for you to work in.
Just a quick follow-up. Is it possible, to exist on a digital platform without giving away anything for free?
It is possible. I mean, you can have a digital platform with nothing for free. The Times of London does that. The Times of London instituted its paywall. It just, you pay for our stuff or you don't get it. And that's it. And a complete hard paywall, they lost 91% of their readers doing it. They're now making money. They're making more money today than they did in the other way. And simply because having people actually pay, even if it's only 10, 12% of what your audience used to be, is giving you more money than you're getting off of advertising in many cases because of what's happening to the prices of digital advertising. So, yeah.
Hi. When you've been looking at these different news sites, how are they dealing with social sharing?
Yep.
Because people want to share articles,
yep.
And how are they allowing for the sharing through Twitter and Facebook? Is it similar to New York Times where you can share it, but if you read 10 or 15 articles, you have to start paying? And are there differences? Or is
there are different policies, and some are allowing sharing, and then some are allowing you to share it, but when it comes, then whoever gets there has to now pay for it. so it goes, yeah, here's a bit of the article, but you want it, you're going to read it. So some are taking both stands. One of the reasons sharing is particularly important is because of its marketing functions. It's because you normally share something to people that don't already take that publication. And so some publishers are saying, we want it to be shared because we know it's going to go to new readers, and that might draw people back to our sites. We also know that among digital consumers, that there's a large proportion of people who are digital consumers who do not consume the same publication in other forms. So there is an advantage because it actually can increase your audience from 5 to 10 times is what many are finding. So the choice is going to be one that you're going to make as a strategic choice of whether you're going to share all of it, share some of it, or not share at all. So, but I think sharing at least is better if you think of it at least on the marketing standpoint, because I think if you're getting new audiences, that's a pretty good deal. Anybody else? All right, well, it's been a pleasure to be here with you. I've enjoyed it. I'll be happy to talk to any of you elsewhere about some of the other research we're doing and some of the things that we're finding in this. It is very clear, however, that we will all be going to payment at some point, and that not going to payment will be a deliberate choice in the same way that operating a free newspaper was a deliberate choice for some companies. And it will not be what we do just because we don't know how to make it work. It'll be a choice that we're going to be free if we're going to be free. So, and that's true whether one has a free site or whether it has some sort of freemium model in there. That's going to be a choices that we're going to be making. Because if people are becoming more and more willing to pay for online quality news and content, we need to start harvesting that money. So, thank you.